Hello, this is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from the beautiful metaverse, and more specifically from beautiful Danville, Illinois, homeland of the Corellian tradition. And this is Midday with Reverend Don. Welcome. And as you know, if you follow Midday with Reverend Don, you can type your questions or comments onto whatever page you happen to be watching on, and they will show up here in my chat room. The chat room is on the screen today since there is no guest. I thought today I would offer mini readings as I occasionally do. So if you would like a mini reading, feel free to ask for one. And I also thought that I would continue our talk about multidimensionality in relevance to things like divination. And hello to Bimby in the chat room. It's good to see you, Bimby. So it occurs to me that one might have the question, if we believe in multidimensionality, what is the point of psychic reading? What is the point of divination? If theoretically, in different timelines, every different future might be played out, how can a divination even be specifically accurate when it can take all these different forms? And of course, part of the answer to that is it's accurate for its own timeline. And another part of that answer also speaks to the reason for divination. And the reason for divination is to be advised about potential futures so that you can change them. And I'm definitely not one of those people who thinks, even within a single timeline, that the future is exactly set in stone. The reason we do readings is to see what actions we can best take to bring about the future we desire. The whole point of magic, the whole point of metaphysics, is the idea that we can change whatever is there, whatever might otherwise be, that we can work our will in the world and create a different future. And this is very much, I think, connected to multidimensionality. It's very much connected to the fluidity of what we think of as reality. When we do magic, we're saying from the very first step that what appears to be our solid world is under the influence of subtle powers, psychic powers, spiritual powers, however you want to put it, not only the obvious physical ones. So right away, we're saying that we accept that reality is more fluid than it appears to be. And, you know, as I've said in the last several days, as we work with more advanced metaphysics and things like multidimensionality, we find out just how fluid it is. And hello to Kayleen in the chat room. And Kayleen wishes us Morang Nyarin from Narm, or Melbourne, Australia, that being good morning in Wiradjuri. And good morning, Kayleen. It's good to see you. I love to talk to everyone in the chat room, and I love the fact that we get people from so many places. And, you know, I have to say, when I was young, and we were channeling the ancestors and what the future was going to hold, it talked about being all over the world and knowing people all over the world and interacting with people all over the world. And that sounded very exciting, but it's so interesting to actually experience it. And hello to George in the chat room. It's good to see you, George. In that world, when I was young, something like this was not unthinkable, but we didn't think we would see it. Most of the people that I knew, we knew that we would have this level of computer technology, but we thought it would be something maybe our children or grandchildren would be seeing, although I suppose this is my grandchildren's generation. But you know, we were thinking of it kind of in terms of what Star Trek had shown us. Star Trek had shown us what, in many ways, leaving aside the space travel aspect, but in many other ways, was our current level of technology, our current level of computers and so forth. The communicators were much like cell phones. In fact, actually, it's a little behind our current level. And they anticipated that being 300 years in the future. And I think a lot of people who were not connected to the computer world did expect it to move at about that pace, and it did not. We got there far faster than we originally thought. And I can only imagine where the next couple of generations will take us. And, I've talked a lot about my belief that we're going to see an increasing physicalization through the metaverse of what we traditionally have done astrally in terms of metaphysics. I think we're going to be seeing, that veil thinning significantly. Hello to Renee in the chat room. It's good to see you, Renee. I know some people who claim that the veil is already gone. I wouldn't go quite that far, but it's thinning rapidly. I personally think that we're going to see computers used for spiritual communication in a far more advanced way than anyone is expecting now, possibly during my own lifetime. I think it's moving very quickly. And I think that there's a lot of fear created by how quickly technology is moving, and not without reason, but this is always the case. If we look back at history, one thing we see again and again is technology moving faster than people wanted it to. Again and again, we see large populations being displaced in terms of their skill sets by new technology, whether we're talking about the agricultural revolution of prehistory, when agriculture replaced hunting as the primary source of food, hunting and gathering, or whether we're talking about the agricultural revolution of the Renaissance, when farming techniques drastically changed, whether we're talking about the coming of industrialization, or whether we're talking about things like the development of modern printing, which also displaced a large number of artisans. There's always painful adjustment. One of my favorite films, The Adding Machine, is all about this process. If you've never seen The Adding Machine, it's really about the afterlife and reincarnation, but the frame story is about a human calculator, which is something there used to be, being replaced by modern mechanical calculators, not modern like we have them, but modern for the 1930s. And this was a big thing that happened, and a lot of people were displaced from their accustomed employment with great human pain involved. And hello to Mary in the chat room. It's good to see you, Mary. This happens again and again. And it brings me back to the same message I've been saying over the last few days. We have to be flexible. We have to be prepared to change. We have to be prepared to adapt. Because what we did yesterday may not be necessary tomorrow. There may not be a place for it. And yes, all of these things that are displaced, some people find ways of continuing. I can think of a number of people who do bookbinding by hand and have an audience for that. It's something I've occasionally done. Bookbinding by hand is where you take your paper or your parchment and you sew it together, and sometimes you use an adhesive to fix it together, and you make the cover by hand, and you assemble the entire book by hand. And it's quite a process. But once, it was the only way books could be made. Today, any kind of popular book, you could never do such a thing. The cost would be prohibitive, but there's still a market for it. And those people who wanted to continue that process and they found their market continue to make them. They're mostly today used as journals and books of shadows. And you find them at places like Renaissance fairs, pagan gatherings, etc. And they sell basically on the level of the artwork. Oh my goodness! Hello to Patty Dunford in the chat room. Patty, it's so good to see you. Patty has been a friend forever, and so lovely to see your name. Um, when we look at these things that are displaced by new technology, some people will find a way to maintain that niche. Um, People who do miniature paintings, you don't find a lot of those today. They were once vitally important. They were displaced by photography. But you will still find a few. There are still some artists who do that as all or part of their profession. There are people who paint regular sized portraits in the same way, even though most people just get a photograph now. But there are still people who want portraits. And this is going to be true of everything that changing technology displaces. If you're willing to find the niche, it will still be there for you. But for the most part, as we find better ways to do things, we're going to change to them. And, people who are affected by this are always upset by it. We're going through huge changes right now. We're going through technological changes and we're going through political changes that are being influenced by the technological changes. And we are moving, as I've said, we're moving to to a state of oligarchy, um, and we have been for a while. And what we're moving from was corporatocracy. Um, there's a difference between these things, and corporatocracy likes long, stable, secure markets. Oligarchy likes disruption, and as you watch, the rising oligarchs are doing their best to stage disruption because that's when they can make the biggest advances for themselves. So if you wonder what's going on, that's part of what's going on. And hello to Timothy Gallagher in the chat room. It's good to see you. Bimby says, I think the return of vinyl records attests to this. Yes, it does. It totally does. It's another example of where something was pushed out of the market and has come back in its own particular niche. Most people aren't going to go out and buy vinyl records today, but there are those who prefer it and will still do it. Same with painted portraits. Same with handmade books. You can buy beautiful jewelry for little amounts of money anywhere in the country and through most of the world. But there are still people who want handmade jewelry. Um, Now, Patty says the more confusion among us, the more they can sneak over on us. And yeah, exactly. This is absolutely true. And the more they can take advantage of it financially. Um, One of the things you'll notice about American business in the last 50 years is the increasing rise of a practice of buying old, stable businesses and selling them off for the value of their parts. I think we're seeing some of that mindset happening. Um, and we're going to see, I think, a vast political change. But, I've talked about this all through the last year, and that astrologically and in terms of historical curve, it's unavoidable. Um, we have been experiencing our national Pluto return, which always brings vast political change. We are at the furthest length at which one form of government usually stands without change. Um, doesn't mean that it will fall, it means it will change. Will it change for the better? Well, we're still here, so we can still work for that. But will it change? I don't think there's any. Well, it already has. Um, and of course, in terms of the turning of the age, years and years ago, back in the 1980s, I started to work on the Correllian calendar. Because back then, all kinds of pagans wanted a non-Judeo-Christian based calendar. You almost never see that now, but then it was a big thing. And I created the Correllian calendar as a practical answer to this problem, which of course did not make it popular with the wider community, which usually doesn't want practical answers. The Correllian calendar in the end was created in such a way that if you use an abbreviation of the Correllian date, meaning the last two numbers, it is the same as the Gregorian date, and therefore you can use it in your daily life while still using a pagan-based calendar. But in doing this, and in figuring out how to divide this, but first I studied the whole idea of the age of Aquarius, and I found that no one agreed on it. Now, today online, you'll find a lot more people do seem to agree on it, but the logic behind the agreement is no stronger than it was then. I ultimately came to feel that numerology and the study of history were the things to base it on. And one of the things I studied was what I called the historical curve. And I was able to identify a particular curve in history. At least that part of history I was most familiar with in terms of the rise and fall of different societies. And it corresponded to about 1600 years, which was also numerologically very, very appropriate. And that became the basis of the Correllian calendar. And Timothy says calendars are always fascinating by design. Yes, they are. What I found is that at the turning of each of the ages, as reckoned through the Correllian calendar, there's a huge collapse in society. Societies that have stood for hundreds of years go down in various ways, while others survive, but in new forms. The last change of the age, the change to the Piscean age, marked the end of the Western Roman Empire and the transformation of the Eastern Empire. But you also see this same thing happening in other parts of the world. If you go back before that to the start of the Aryan Age, you see the fall of the cultures in the Fertile Crescent and the transformation of Egyptian culture, which went forward but became different, substantially different. So one of the things I think we will see is we're going to see over the course of generations, we're going to see a lot of things that had been quite stable cease to exist and take on totally new forms. And others will continue to exist, but they will take on new forms too. And is this going to be good or bad? Well, it's going to have to do with letting go a lot of the poisons of the Piscean age. And the more we're willing to let them go, the better everything is going to be. And we who are magical need to work with this. We need to work on adjusting that new age. And, I have spent a lot of my life talking about being the midwives and then the nannies of the new age. And, to a large extent, my role in this is ending, because no matter how much longer I live, I'm only going to see part of what's going to happen. I will move among the ancestors long before these changes are complete, to the extent that it's ever really complete. Mary says, this is fascinating. Yes, it is. It absolutely is. And I think this is one of the things about life that is very frustrating. Because no matter what part you happen to die during, there's going to be something whose outcome you won't see. But of course, you're going to be curious about it. Now, when you've crossed over as an ancestor, you may see it, or you may not care anymore. I suspect, judging by the general behavior of the Correllian ancestors, that I will still be very much involved. But I know that consciously, I won't really see how all of this works out any more than anyone else ever has. I think of my mother, who crossed into spirit in 1989, and think of the world that she left versus the world I'm in There are so many things she never saw, and probably was quite happy for that. Um, and the future she might have expected at the time of her crossing is not the one that we're living in, and that is only to be expected from life. It's always full of surprises. It's always full of change. And I think this is part of the purpose of life. I've often described, and Mary says, we'll be bugging the heck out of you when you cross over. And yes, I've been trained for that my whole life, so go right ahead. It was once said of me that a friend of mine once said that they expected that I would be spending my afterlife continuing basically what I was doing when I was doing Rev Don's vlog, answering people's questions every day. And I suspect there's truth in that. And I'm perfectly fine with that. Um, I've spent my life on the receiving end of that kind of spiritual guidance, so I certainly hope that I will be able to um, be on the other end when I cross over. But I'm often caught by the changes in the world. One of the things that sometimes catches my attention, I've mentioned this before. When I was young and dinosaurs ruled the earth, um, elderly people, depending what we want to consider elderly, but um, anyone above the age of 70 had lived through the First World War and the culture that preceded it. They could, um, in most cases, remember the Edwardian period at least as children. Some had been adults then. And I learned a lot talking to those older people. I have um, a great deal of firsthand testimony of what life was like in the Edwardian period, in the 1920s, in World War II, because all those people were alive and they were talking about it. And one of my favorite films is Harold and Maude, which would probably totally freak out the younger generation now, but it was very popular with the younger generation when it was my generation. And it's about the love affair between, I think, an 18-year-old boy and an 80-year-old woman. And the woman is Ruth Gordon. But one of the interesting things about this is she talks about her memory of Europe before the war during the Age of Kings, in which she at least tells the story that she had been part of that world. But yes, people were still alive from that era. The people who were doing prohibition and so forth, which, like most people in Illinois, I'm related to most of them, but they were there to tell me this is what that was like. This is what the great parties of the Gatsby era were actually like. I don't have to worry about what fashion was like in the 20s. My grandmother and other women of her generation had it still in their closets in many cases, or in their jewel boxes. Um, and I have to tell you, some of the jewelry of that generation, I will always remember for its beauty. The art glass was amazing. You don't see anything like it now, nor do you often see it um, in the antique shops, because it was not the common thing. But my grandmother had a wonderful collection of it. Somewhere I have her keychain, which was a piece of art glass with decorative beading from the 1920s. Um, Never seen another one like it. When I think of young people today, none of those realities are available to them to experience from people who had lived it. Yes, they can read the books and they can look at the films, and they can actually look at films from the 1920s and 30s. Something earlier generations certainly couldn't, but those people are gone. Those people who can say, well, yeah, that's what it says in the film, but this is what it was like in real life. because those films aren't always representative of real life. Those books aren't always representative of it either. I'm very much caught by the fact that an elderly person today is of my mother's generation. Um, my father would be 102 years old were he living physically today. Um, they are the superannuated people now. Um, and I myself am the elderly generation. And that's interesting. It's an interesting thing to adjust your mind to. And to realize again, one of the things I think about, we had a traumatic death last week here at the house. But one of the things I often think about are friends of mine who have died over the years and what they never lived to see. How amazed they might be by what the future was. And the other thing is, when I look at young people, I remember the disco era. I realize when I see people who are patrons of disco music or disco fashion on Instagram and so forth now, they're looking at something from before they were born. And that's just amazing. But it speaks to the constant movement of time. And it also speaks to the fact that in the end, we have little more than our perception to base our understanding on. In some cases, we actually have people we can talk to who were present. But in most cases, we cannot have any kind of first-hand experience, only second-hand experience of things that are in the past or that are far away. And that always comes through someone's lens. And so it's up to us to decide what feels right to us. And so many things, I think, there really is no way to say this is the one and only objective truth, because two people can experience the same event and sometimes come away with vastly different versions of it, because from their angle, it was different. As we go through life, this is one of those reasons we need to remain flexible. We need to remember also that our perception may be warped. And we need to be open to the fact that what someone else is telling us may be truthful from their point of view, even if it differs from our own. And that can be hard to accept sometimes, but it's important to bear it in mind. And in the end, we do the best we can with all these different things to build the best lives for ourselves and those we love and the world as a whole. At least I hope that we do. And when the time does come to return to the ancestors, hopefully we can look back on what we did and be pleased with it. I've often heard it said that it's the things you don't do that you may regret when you come to the end. And I believe that's absolutely true. And so I've tried to do a lot of different things, and I recommend that to you also. And if sometimes they succeed, that's wonderful. And sometimes they fail, that's still an experience. And either way, you know what will happen. You don't have to wonder, well, what if I had done that? There are always going to be things where you look and say, well, I could have done that differently. But in the end, we have what we have. We have where our point of consciousness is. Now, going back to multidimensionality, there may be different versions of these things, but our point of consciousness is always in one particular timeline. And I do wonder a bit about our existence in spirit when we have crossed over, and I guess there's still time to try to learn more about that, but the different versions of us that exist in the different dimensions, do they all come back together or do they continue separately? And do they interact with each other? I have to say, Spirit has never commented on that. So maybe that's a new frontier to look at. But anyway, we've come to that moment when we talk about our sponsors. Once again, I'm offering a special price on readings for the next probably 24 hours. If you're interested in a reading, you can get an hour-long reading from me at the reduced price of $80 versus my normal price, as I'm trying to catch up on first of the month bills. I hope that will be of interest to some people. And I want to thank those people who've already taken me up on the offer. And I want to remind you that my new book is out, Rev Don's Book of Stones, Metals, and Crystals, which is an extremely encyclopedic book on those subjects. And if you have not already ordered your copy, you can get it from CorellianPublishing.com. And with that, let us go on to hear potatoes.
Ready to unlock the secrets of the universe? Join me, Rev Don Lewis, for my metaphysical and magic auctions at Gaia Thrift at whatnot.com. Discover fascinating artifacts, mystical crystals, and rare and unusual books that could change your life. Don't miss this chance to bring a little magic into your world. Rev Don's Metaphysical and Magic Auctions, where the extraordinary can become yours.
And thank you to our sponsors, Equinox Learning Hub and Rev Don's Metaphysical and Magic Auctions. Our next auction will be Friday evening at 7 p.m. I hope you'll join us for that. And I hope you've enjoyed the program. The conversation must have been interesting because nobody asked for a mini reading. I have my cards and everything, but if you found the conversation more interesting than that, I'm very happy to hear that. And maybe I will, for the immediate future, continue talking about the witchness of the why, as Lady Bitterwind used to put it. And I want to thank you for joining me. I'll be back again tomorrow. And let us close with our prayer, as we always do. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for all that you do for us in our lives, and we rejoice in this walk we walk together. We ask you to continue to be with us and guide us as we go forward, and to help us to remain flexible and adaptive to the many experiences that are all around us, and to the changes that constantly happen in this physical world. Beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you with great love. Knowing you're always with us, still from respect, we thank you for your presence, and may you be blessed now and always. May you be blessed now and always, and I'll see you again tomorrow.